Hi, welcome. U.S. history final session for the week. So we are done after today. We're going to be taking a little break while we wait to see what exactly the College Board is going to be doing with the tests. They're supposed to be announcing things on Friday. And so let us know. You can tell us in the chat. Are there any other AP subjects that you guys are taking tests for that you would like for something like this to be set up for? I know that we've had like, we have US history, world history, biology, but are there some other tests that you like human geography or psychology or anything like that? So let us know in the chat, and we would we want to keep track of that and see. So but we will be back. We are really wanting to do stuff like this off and on during this hiatus from school, and so let us know what you want to do. But for us, today is our final US history one. And also, like a couple people were mentioning, you can see, even if you came in late, like maybe you just found out about it on Wednesday or whatever, you can still go back and watch all of the other ones. There's still some other, all the videos that we recorded are available that you can go back and watch all of those. And so you can see the earlier stuff that we covered as well. So I'm seeing psychology is good, human geo. I have friends who have kids the same age as you guys, like I do, and a lot of them have said human geo for sure would be something they liked. So cool. Well, we will pass that stuff on and make sure that people above us are able to hear that. So let's get on with US history. Now today, we are dealing with We the People, talking about social reform. There is a little bit of a problem with this section as far as like the material in it. There's actually two. One, it's not covered as much in class. That's one of the problems. And two, a lot of it doesn't resolve itself until after World War II. And so if you remember, based on what the AP, what the College Board is saying, again, we show this every time because I want to make sure if we have anyone new that they remember it. Tests are only going to be about 45 minutes. They're not going to have any multiple choice. It's all free response. And so you're going to be proving your content knowledge through your answers by being able to link things. And so we'll find out the exact details on Friday, April 3rd, but we do know that they're going to be cutting off the last fifth of that class, of all of the classes, basically 20% to 25% of all of the classes. And so that pretty much knocks US history off at World War II. So kind of tough when things like the civil rights bills go through in 65 and things like that. How do you cover those things? Okay. And so that is one of the issues. The other one, like I said, is that there's not a lot of coverage in this in your classes, not nearly as much as some other things. So we've gone through all these need to know concepts. If you haven't seen this, check it out, and make sure that you are able to work your way through each of those topics. Social reform. So this is going to be the main things we're talking about are going to be like how women are treated throughout US history, how minorities, especially Blacks, are treated throughout US history. That's going to be it. There also are things like workers in the social reform for them. Most of that gets wrapped up into the labor and industry topic, but that would also possibly fall under social reform. There's going to be some medical stuff that could fall under there, but it's not, again, not tested nearly as much. Okay. So Social reform, the 19th century, you're gonna start to see that some of these movements find their roots in other movements, and they kind of parallel. But unfortunately, it seems like only one can be addressed at a time. It just is, that's how it feels. It's like people don't want to change everything too fast. So this goes all the way back to the 1790s, the Second Great Awakening. And so when you're looking at this, people are like, wait a minute, there's a lot of stuff that we are allowing that is not reflective of what we should be teaching. These are going to be, Protestant groups that are going to go back to the Bible. They're going to look at it. They're going to say, these things aren't right. We should not be having slaves. We should not be treating women this way. We should be trying to help out with other areas. And so there you start to see this rise of social activism, even all the way back to the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century. But it does not stay consistent, and you also seem to where we can't have too many tracks going at the same time. Like we've got one or the other, and so like you have like the temperance movement, which is the limiting alcohol consumption. These women pushing for this, a lot of them turn into abolitionists, but the temperance movement is more of what they're wanting to be dealt with. And so that almost becomes more important for a lot of people. You also do see the nativism is going to be tied up in that. And so some people that were trying to stop alcohol was trying also because it was going to hurt different ethnic groups. Then you can see, like on that fourth point, sometimes there will be a proxy issue where it's like, so people recognize that too much alcohol could cause people to be violent at home or in public. And so it kind of now, because we're talking about this one issue, we can also talk about this other issue. But seeing a lot of this stuff is not, like I said, it's not going to be resolved. You're not going to see a lot of movements to really help a lot of these issues until after World War II. And so if the test truly has a hard stop on World War II, it's going to leave a lot of these things kind of dangling there. And so that's going to be interesting to see how they deal with stuff like that. But still, I would advise at least knowing the outcome of stuff. So like if you're talking about dealing with like domestic violence and stuff like that, I mean, you've seen huge movements in that regards in the last couple of years. It's grown to that, and now it's become public enough that people try to deal with that. But up until that point, it was not gaining a lot of traction. So abolitionism, they were tied together. The same people that were running one thing would also be running another. Because if you go back to the Great Awakening, you saw there were 4 different things that they all were like, hey, we should be doing this. They were talking about temperance, education, women's rights, and abolitionism. So those 4 things, a lot of those people are going to be backing all 4 of those things. And then they kind of see which one has the most traction, which one has the most political support. And so then they push that one for a while, and then it flips to another one and pushes that one for a while. So temperance ultimately is going to end up leading to prohibition. But that's going to be later on into the history. Women's suffrage, which, as they say in Friends, sounds like a bad thing, but it's not. The women's right to vote. You're going to see, again, people who are active in the abolitionist movement are also going to be active in the women's suffrage movement. So you're going to have people like Sarah and Angelina Grimke, the Seneca Falls Conference, the Declaration of Sentiments, which was supposed to like mirror the Declaration of Independence, that women were created equal to men and that they should be treated well. They should be treated better than what they were being treated. They should be given the right to vote. Because again, when we talk about linking things together, when you go all the way back to the colonies, to their documents, all of those things, property owning men were the ones who were allowed to vote and women were not. And so that was a constant issue from early on all the way through. As the Civil War became the major focus of the country, women's suffrage basically disappeared into the background. A lot of things disappeared into the background because that was the major event of the day. And so it comes back afterwards, later on, once things are able to be dealt with. So you're going to have Stanton and Anthony. They had rival organizations, not like rival, like, you know, Jets and Sharks or whatever kind of thing, but they kind of approach things from different points of view. It's actually really fascinating. Hopefully you guys have been able to cover Stanton and Anthony and how they really kind of came at things from two different points of view. They had two different goals and everything, but they ultimately were able to work together to get things off the ground. But they actually, it's a pretty interesting story when you're able to look at both of them. Now, out west, you have a totally different situation. Like when you're out on the frontier, you know, people are going to have different rules because, I mean, we're far away. You can even still see that, you know, today, where it's like the further away from the seat of government you are, the more you can probably get away with, the less you need to follow like all of the specific little things. And so Western states have a little bit more of a frontier attitude. And so some of them had allowed women to vote in their elections. But it was not a national thing. And so when you're talking about the seat of power being in the East, DC, and then obviously the major influences along the East Coast, that's where the traction has to happen for anything to get done. So finally in 1920, I mean, have you thought 100 years ago this year, when the 19th Amendment was passed, when women finally were allowed to vote? So America has been a country at this point for 150 years, is that right? 1776, 1860, yeah. So it's like 150 years, and women are finally allowed to vote. So, but that doesn't solve everything. If you're a woman, if you know a woman, you probably understand that women still are not treated the same. They make less per hour. They have to put up with more garbage. There's still ways to go on this, which is why I say sometimes the conclusion or the apparent conclusion doesn't happen until after World War II. Matthew is asking if we should know each woman. I would know the main ones. Yes, I would definitely know the main ones, because for example, if there is a question on the Seneca Falls Conference, you know, you need to know what that did, or if they ask about Anthony and Stanton. Now, admittedly, with this test being smaller and short, they're going to have to do a lot of pruning. So I don't know what topics are going to get a lot of the questions, but I would be prepared no matter what. These are questions, like when you go back and look at the practice, when you look at the tests and the practice tests, these are frequently short answer questions are going to deal with stuff like social reform, because it is such a great way to show that string, that thread. Like, so here's the thing. We have, I mean, when you're talking about like the 1600s for like colonization, And then you're over here now at 2020. And you're trying to have somebody prove, like show what they know and that they really grasp US history. You're going to want to see, like, look at what topics could be asked about that existed throughout that 400 years. Okay. I mean, some of the things that we've fought about, some of the things that have become like the big overwhelming thing of the day weren't around back then. They weren't around in the 1600s. They may not have popped up until the 1900s, you know? And so there's a lot of things that happened in the last 100 years, but they didn't go all the way back. Things about women and blacks and education and all of those things, those are topics that were dealt with from when the boats first landed with people. And so that ends up being a really good question to ask for these open-ended questions. You got to think about what topics they can ask about that have a big tie. They can say, you know, how was the foreign policy different between the Civil War and World War I or something like that. I mean, yeah, you're tying together two big events, but if they really want to see your grasp of history, your grasp of how the country has changed, how the environment and all atmosphere of a country has changed, the way they're going to be able to do that is they're going to say, how were women treated here? And trace for me how they're different, how it's different here. You know, because that's going to show your handle of 400 years of history. So that's why I encourage you to, like, the topics we talked about yesterday, and the topics we talked about today. Like yesterday was immigration, migration, people movement, talking about social reform today, looking even at like industry, those kind of things, the economy, like how did the economy change throughout? Those are going to be great short answer questions because it's going to require you to have a lot of knowledge in different areas. So just something to think about. But like the people that are up here, the big things that are up here, those are the ones that I would tell you, make sure you at least know this, you know, you need to at least know the bigger names and the 1920, 19th Amendment thing like that stuff. The Seneca conference is a very large deal that you should know about. Hey, here's a question. So number one is actually a question about the Seneca Falls Convention. So let me give you a minute to work on that one. Tell us your answer in the chat. All right, see a lot of answers in the chat. A lot of people marking C. Is C right? Let's see. Yes, C is correct. So here's knowing like the purpose. Think about this this way, okay? Was it to claim the right to vote? Yeah, they wanted that to happen. Did they want all female colleges? Maybe, I don't, there were like things like that. Demand that women be added to the, if there's one thing that this topic is going to show us, it's that things written on paper don't mean anything. I mean, trust me, you're gonna see things where, oh, well, that should be taken care of. Nope, not taken care of. And so just adding a word to the Declaration is not what they want. What they want is a general mindset where the rights of women are the same as the rights of men. That's what they're wanting. These other things will stem from that. But the general hope is that at some point, the country will realize that women and men deserve the same treatment. And so it's more than just the right to vote. It's more than just lip service or erasing a word and adding 2 letters or whatever. It's a mindset that they're hoping for. And so the Declaration of Sentiments, which did come out of that, is very similar to the Declaration of Independence, but it's that the rights are the same. Those same natural rights that applied to men for the Declaration of Independence applied to women. It was applied to people in general. And if you see, you can see when they're talking that way, how people that were involved in one movement would easily be involved in another one. Because if you're sitting there espousing that you feel that these rights should be the same for everyone, how do you eliminate somebody? It should be the same for everyone except for them. Well, then it's not everyone. You have a different definition of everyone than I do. And so you can see why there's overlap in these different movements. All right, which of the following was not a key factor for women gaining increased civil rights during the Second Great Awakening? So we'll go ahead and think through that and put your answer in the chat. Okay, so I'm seeing answers coming in. Remember, when was the Second Great Awakening? We were talking about that started in 1790. 1790. Women were elected to public office. So if women were not allowed to vote, why would they be allowed to run for office? Why would they be elected to office? So, I mean, we know that this is not, C is not going to be dealing with that. The other ones, they do become more involved in these different regards. They do start to have more roles in different areas. So religion, not all of them, it's not talking about all of the religions, but there are some where they had more roles. They were leading in abolition movements, but if they're not getting the right to vote until 1920, then this cannot be happening in 1790. Okay, so they were not getting elected if they're not even allowed to vote. So I did not update that one thing. Okay, abolitionism. So we're going to see this. This is obviously the biggest of these social reform movements. And the Second Great Awakening was when there were people who started to question whether or not this was okay, whether or not this was something that should even exist. In 1833, William Lloyd Garrison founded the American Anti-Slavery Society. But even in this movement here, even in this group, there was a splintering based on if women could be involved or not. And so there were some who, the Liberty Party let the women, the Foreign Anti-Slavery Society did not. So and that's one unfortunate component of this, is when you have a very small minority of the country that is trying to push forward these things, and then they can't agree on just what they should be pushing forward, you start to really dilute your message. And so now, instead of working together, we have two different groups because they can't decide on who's allowed to be in it. And so it's just kind of ridiculous when one I mean, if you're sitting there going, oh, this should not apply, but it applies, kind of thing. I don't understand how you can have like two positions that seem to be very opposite. So you have Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Frederick Douglass. These are going to be free African American leadership. They are a part of demonstrating what people had been through, bringing things to people's attention, participating in different things to actively fight against slavery. In the 1850s, which we talked about a few sessions ago, there was a lot of scrapping going on about what people believed with slavery and the states coming in. And the Republican Party emerged from basically all the anti-slavery people from all the different parties joined together and founded the Republican Party. And that was in 1854. They were the ones who had Lincoln run, won in 1860, which led to the Civil War. So, Civil War's over, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are passed, and everything is better. Not at all. And this is where one of the problems comes on this topic, is that those amendments were passed in 1865. But the 14th and 15th were not observed in this country until 1965. For 100 years, Jim Crow laws and other different things that they were in effect that kept Blacks from being allowed to vote. Different taxes, different, even the law that former felons couldn't vote. And I mean, like, one of the examples with that is that people, when they say, former criminals aren't, allowed to vote in elections, that still is a rule in many states here in the country. Well, the reason that started was because they would arrest Blacks for loitering, because some of them didn't have jobs. And so they would just arrest them that they were standing around. They would arrest them, charge them with loitering, which was a federal offense. And then all of a sudden they were a convict, and then they couldn't vote. And so, I mean, that's where that law started. So there were so many different things in place to stop and to end the rights that they should have had after the Civil War. I even mentioned the other day in class how many slaves were freed from the Emancipation Proclamation. And the answer is 0. There were none. The Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves in the South, where the people there didn't care what Lincoln was saying. And then they were not freed in the border states, where there were slaves and where those people still actually answered to Lincoln. And so the Emancipation Proclamation was more of a rallying cry than an actual ending of slavery. So even these things that are on the books as amendments to the Constitution are not followed. And there's really no way to make them be followed until the Civil Rights Acts are passed in 1965. I mean, my mom graduated from high school in 1963. When you're thinking about how long ago that was 9 years before I was born. That's how recent these things happen. It's mind-boggling how long these things took. I mean, if the slave trade began in 1620 and the Civil Rights Acts did not pass until 1965, so 345 years it took. And still, you could argue that there's still remnants of this all over. I live in South Carolina. Trust me, there are remnants of this all over. And so there's still a lot to wrap your mind around to understand this process. At least they probably did, but the problem is that they also had laws in place that Northerners could not help runaway slaves, and the people going back to get runaway slaves basically said anybody who's black is a runaway slave. So I mean, it wasn't like there were people in the South that were like, yeah, let's go. I mean, there may have been some here and there, but most people most blacks in the South had no option. It wasn't like they can go up north and be free, because that they still could get reclaimed and brought back. So, okay, so I'm going to give you guys a minute to read this passage, this excerpt here. Questions 3 and 4 are going to come from it. This is from 1860's Republican Party platform that Lincoln ran on. Go ahead and read that, and then we're going to have a couple of questions based on it. Okay, so this is going to be the Republican Party platform. They are, it's going to be where slavery should not be allowed, that they do not want it to be allowed anywhere. This is where they're making their move. It's not just going to be like, let's not let it advance. They're starting to make a move of, we want this to be gone. And so let's look at a couple of questions about it. I'm going to give you 30 seconds to work on number 3. Put your answer into the chat. Okay, so on this one, I mean, even though, again, multiple choice are not going to be on the test, but understanding what exactly things did is going to be very helpful. Emancipation Proclamation was not a law, so there was nothing to pass about that. This would be like granting slaves equal rights. No, that is not what they are saying. In fact, there still were movements, people within the Republican Party who just wanted them freed, but still did not want to give them any rights. Lincoln, even at one point, that was his stance. And so they were against slavery, but it wasn't like, hey, okay, they're like, hold on, we don't want to take this too far. It is going to be they don't want slavery spread to the new territories. And they were hesitant even until like 1864 with the second Lincoln election to be there, where their stance was, we want this gone. they still weren't saying it even in 1860. They weren't ready to like completely repeal it everywhere. So popular sovereignty, that was that each state decides. They were not in favor of that because then they may get a state that came in without listening to them, and that's not what they want. So as you can see, 1860, they're not ready to like say that like the border states or whatever have to get rid of it. They're just like nobody else is coming in with it. By 1864, they're like, no, it's gone. We want it out. So, all right, look at number 4. Oh, you guys see it? You see the question here? You see how that could be something on test day where they pull this together? Which was it most like? Okay, so 30 seconds to work on this one. This is definitely going to be a good example of how you need to connect ideas. So try to see which one of these is most overlapping. Look which one was something that people who were they would be oftentimes in leadership of both. And look at the lines in the platform. Life, liberty, property. Oh, we're talking about rights. We're talking about the Constitution. We're talking about all of that. That's going to give us answer choice C. So the women's suffrage movement and the abolitionist movement are going to have a lot of parallels because they're trying to extend rights from the Constitution to a group of people who are not being represented yet. The temperance union, that's just wanting to get rid of alcohol. So it's a little different. And the labor movements, again, it's not about granting constitutional rights. All right, so now we get to our short answer, wanting to look at how we can deal with these tying together stuff and learning about different. Elise, you figured it out. It was not intentional, but all of the answers were C. It actually was actually true. All 4 of them were C. That was not intended. It was a complete fluke, but you are correct. They were. But again, on test day, that won't work because there's no multiple choice questions. Okay, short answer. So this one is going to surround women's rights. We've got a picture here that they're asking about. And so we want to have one historical development or circumstance from 1848 to 1917. And then we have that C. Now, here's the problem, is that half of that question comes from 1950 to 1980. We're not covering after World War II on the test. However, we don't know for sure if that means that they're going to like cut off everything that drags into past 1940, if you understand what I'm saying. Like, so we've got World War II. Does that mean that they're not going to talk at all about the rise of the Soviet Union because it didn't happen until after World War II, even though because of World War II is why it happened? You know, are they not going to ask after 1945 about anything that happened in the civil rights movement or anything that happened in the women's suffrage movement? I don't know. We don't know that. So what I'm suggesting and what we kind of are thinking about is, at least if you've got a topic that exists earlier in US history, you know, make sure you know how it resolves or where it's left, even if that is a little bit after World War II. I wouldn't say like just stop studying. I'm thinking what they're talking about this is all conjecture. This is just kind of guessing. But I'm thinking we're not going to need to like know the details of Korean War and Vietnam War and the War on Terror and stuff like that. Those are not going to be things that they're going to ask about. But I would be a little surprised if they just don't even reference anything that still has stuff going on after World War II. So at least have an idea on some of these things, like where it goes, so that if you do reference like the 1965 Civil Rights Act, you know, that you still can do that, you know. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to look at these. We're going to go one by one. I'm going to give you like 2 minutes to look at each one of these. Make sure that when you're thinking about it, that you do pay attention, that you're answering the entire prompt, that you're doing what they say. If they put restrictions on it, that you're following those. Like for B, you only are doing 1848 to 1917. So don't bring up something that happened in 1920, stuff like that. And don't just say the example, but how does that apply? So number one, letter A, I'm gonna give you 2 minutes. What is one perspective about women's rights that is expressed in the image? So explain one perspective. So just looking at the picture, tell us in the chat, what is something that is being expressed there? Okay, so I'm looking at people putting in their thoughts. Good, good. Yeah, talking about they're wanting the same rights. And they're using, so this is 1917. And so thinking about what's going on then, we're talking about World War I, and they're saying, oh, you're wanting to fight for liberty overseas. You want to fight the German problem over there. What about here? What about here? There's not liberty here. We don't have what we need here. So good points. Yeah, good points. So there's a possible answer right there. They're participating in politics, but they still didn't have the right to vote. They're using some of the rights that are granted about like where they're allowed to picket and protest, and that they feel like they should have that right, which is 100% true. And they do get it 3 years later, but this is part of that movement. So good job, guys. So next one, letter B, one specific historical example from so keep in mind, 1848 to 1917 that led to this. Okay, so try to think of a specific thing that happened that led them to this point where they were pushing for the Suffrage Act. All right, so something from 1848 to 1917 that led to this. I see we've got Seneca Falls Convention, definitely. World War I, the start of World War I, the issues around World War I, you would probably be able to use actually fighting in it. That's touchy because we don't really get into it until the end of that. I'd like the idea about the Civil War. That's actually really nice. That was really, really good. That they were more involved in non-traditional roles. They were more active in things, and so they were able to say, "Oh, look at this! I wasn't. If we were involved in this, then we should be able to involve in that." There wasn't as much of like the factories and things like that happened back in the Civil War, but we do see some of that in World War I. We especially see that in World War II. So. So a sample response here, they talk about the Seneca Falls Convention, the Declaration of Sentiments. So remember, when they do ask a question like this, if they are asking something like this, you have to make sure that you explain it too and why it applies. And so don't just say the Seneca Falls Convention, you want to make sure that you explain what about it would have led to this point. And so it was that, this Declaration of Sentiments got the ball rolling, got people started to talk about it, built up political intrigue and all of that. So this one is going to be tougher because it does go into the 1950s to 1980s. But also think about maybe something that happened, just maybe think about something after 1920 that may have gone to help in advancing women's rights. We could go with that too. So it may be not just 1950. There are other things that happen after 1920 that go to advance their rights. So come up with something after 1920 that is going to be something that helps. Because this is a difference between the 1950 and 1980. I mean, you could do that. So that is the question, but then also, you know, maybe so that you can test what they might do on test day, is think of something that helped after 1920, or how it changed after 1920. So. All right, I like what you guys are saying. I really do. Some of it, I mean, you got some specific things like Maria mentioned Title IX in 1972. I think it was Harish was talking about like that there was it was like they got the right to vote, and then it was like beyond that, it was like, okay, we're going to be even more, we're not going to stop there. We're going to be even more vocal trying to get everything to be level ground. And you're going to see right here, the later ones have been on equality all the way across the board. I brought Rosie the Riveter popped up on screen while you guys were working because I wanted you to maybe think about that this is actually one of the big things that helps the movements later on, and it still would fall into our time period that they're going to test on, is the role of women during World War II, where they did fill in, and some of you mentioned this, they did fill in with jobs that were not traditionally women's jobs. And so they were so involved in things like that, that it was really hard afterwards to go and say, okay, now you go back home because that's all you're good for, when they've been doing something, they've been doing things all along, you know? They were filling in, which was also, if you want to take this and apply it to another area we talked about, it was one of the same arguments that was dealing with the rights for blacks, was because they were fighting over in World War II. They were fighting alongside, they had their own groups that were fighting. The Americans were fighting for freedom, fighting for people. I mean, they're fighting against suppression of a group, and then that group is, they have their own group that's back home being suppressed. And there were a lot of people who came back and were like, we can't keep, this is wrong. You know, this is like, this is no better than what the Nazis were doing. And so there was a lot of, that gave some ground too, that helped both of those things. So if someone does, even if they do truncate the time, World War II ended up being very important for both movements, because it gave some examples of just how valuable and deserving of rights both those groups were. So sadly enough, that is the end. It is And now the end is near. It actually is over. So we loved having you here. Hopefully you guys can keep on practicing things. We are going to hopefully be back for some more sessions later on once we get all of the direct details from College Board. So, but just keep your eyes out on our page and everything like that, and we will be glad to let you know when things are going to be launching again. It's been awesome. Thank you for participating. You guys were so good. It was so awesome participating with you guys and talking through these different topics. I love teaching history. Thank you to Heather. She did a great job as well. And so if you hang on, we've got at the top of the hour, we still have Ari and Nick for their final biology lesson. And have an awesome weekend. Stay safe.